the volume that Christy and Catherine edited it's very good to make you think about, in terms of creating a mindset about how you might approach another ancient text. And that is, the books of the New Testament, any early Christian writing, anything written at that time, because slavery was universal. It was the water that people swam in, and it was so much there that, in a sense, it was invisible to the people who were living in it in certain respects, even though slaves would be around them all the time. And we have to do a little more work when we read ancient texts in order to make slaves visible in that way, to be aware of them.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is William Owens. This is the fifth, and possibly the final installment. I don't know. I'll keep reaching out to people. There's some interesting contributors I haven't talked to yet. But this is the fifth installment in my series of interviews on the book Ancient Slavery and its New Testament Contexts. I like this book. I like everybody I've talked to about it so far. So I will keep this short. If you're listening for free, follow, like, subscribe, rate, review, do all those things wherever it is. I'm trying to do more on YouTube. I post every time I come out with a new episode or every time I do a new interview on all the different social media applications. So follow me there, reach out to me there, shoot me feedback or guest suggestions or just any thoughts you might have at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Or if you're feeling really generous, and we are approaching the holiday season, $5 a month gets you episodes 10 days early now, but a little bit more than that coming January of 2026. I'll be releasing Patreon episodes on Monday, and then they come out the Friday of the following week. So that's quite a separation. You get them pretty far ahead of time. Yeah, I think that covers it all. Enjoy my conversation with William Owens. I will be back at the end to set up a preview for next week. Enjoy. William Owens, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. For viewers, you can see over my shoulder here the Ancient Slavery and its New Testament Contexts. I don't know if you can hear the dogs snoring, but they're also there. But we're going to be discussing with William Owens his chapter, Literary Constructions and Stereotypes of Slavery. But before we get into that, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. There's an academic biography that began in graduate school, let's say at Yale. I picked as my topic the Roman comic playwright Plautus, who lived and wrote at the end of the 3rd century, the 200s BC, and died sometime, maybe about the year 180 BC. And I got interested in how Plautus, all of his comedies are set in Greek and have characters that are notionally Greek, but he really worked on ethnic stereotypes of Greeks and Romans in the comedies. And I wrote about how some of the characters seem more Greek than other ones, like in particular the slave characters, clever slaves. And some of the characters seem positively Roman instead. And eventually I got a job at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And I ended up teaching what back in the day was called a sort of Life of the Romans course, a title that was outmoded even when I started doing it. It was really a social history course. And that took me back to looking at slaves. And in terms of working the course up, it meant that I was reading some historians of slavery. My background was originally in literary criticism and looking at literary texts like Plautus. But I began to read historians of Roman slavery, Keith Bradley. And reading Bradley, it really intrigued me because he's a maybe almost a generational historian of Roman slavery. But he gave a lot of illustrations that came from the Greek novels. I hadn't really read the Greek novels when I was in graduate school, and I was really intrigued about how was it that an historian of Roman slavery was illustrating aspects of the institution and its effect on individuals trying to imagine that from the Greek novel. And that got me in there. And instinctively, I began to read against the grain and of course, became much more immersed in the study of Roman slavery and then also how it was represented in ancient Greek and Roman literature. And I've been doing that for a while now. And my main thesis in a book that came out of that initial work was that the ancient novel itself came into being as an account of enslavement and the trial of slavery and eventually redemption. And that some of the early authors were likely, there's evidence that they had been slaves. So that's my academic biography, as it were.
So it's an interesting story, and having spoken to them, and then it takes me so long to get episodes out. A
Yeah,
podcast called The Two Cities has already put their conversation with Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner
right.
out there, but it's an interesting way that they just kind of went through the orchard picking who was going to be a contributor to this book. What's that story for you? Like, how did you get brought into this project?
Well, I'm pushy. I am my further research took me towards early Christian texts, including the Apocryphal Acts. And I learned my professional organization is the Society for Classical Studies. There's also the SBS, the Society for, what is it again? It's the Society for Bible Studies, the SBS. And I saw, as I was reading this, I came across the work of Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner, and I saw that they did a lot of work with classical texts, and they knew a lot more about my texts than I knew about their texts, let's say. And I became very interested in what they were having to say. And I noticed that there was a lot of literature going back almost to the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century about the close literary formal ties between the Apocryphal Acts and the Greek novel as well. And this was fascinating to me. So I became interested in how these texts depicted slaves. And that's what cued me in and I introduced myself by email to Christy, who's a couple of book chapters and articles I'd read, and I was on her radar screen in that way. And it's a discussion that's continuing.
Yeah, I'm glad to see that of the many people who, I don't know, their brains and relationships were broken by COVID, it seems like these two ladies developed a relationship with one another, but also, at least as far as this book goes, they seem to have cultivated a number of relationships that have come together in this project. And I am particularly appreciative. I've only done a handful so far, but to see the impact of New Testament scholars peeking over into classical studies. And it seems to, for the most part, have introduced methodologies and understandings that maybe, I don't know, moving the ball forward, gaining some yards, however you want to say that, for particularly for New Testament biblical studies. So I appreciate your cooperation. And yeah, they should be paying attention to what you and other classicists are doing. So I'll stop. I'll stop gushing over you. I'm sure there's plenty of that. I do want to say, and I'm more calling this out so I don't forget to bring it up.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned reading against the grain, because I know that's where your chapter ends.
Right.
And I think by way of trying to work into your chapter, so literary depictions of enslaved people and the stereotypes that they may create or derive from, are these, should we see these as an attempt to polemicize enslavement, or is it just so much that this is the soil that this literature grew out of?
It's the second one. It's not like the 19th century where you had pro slavery polemicists defending the what they call the peculiar institution, which Northerners couldn't understand. There wasn't really as far as we know, a fully articulated response to slavery itself as an institution. So it's slavery and its basic premises, as far as we can tell, was not really challenged. So there wasn't a defense of slavery in those terms. What we see here is just an assumption, a set of assumptions that's made by authors who were overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, in the elite. And the same goes for their readers.
It may, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be that the 19th century context, particularly American context, was that discourse was more didactic and directed at the point, in addition to the fact that there was more opposition at that time. So the polemicizing or the polemics for enslavement had to be more direct in and of themselves. But I don't know, there's the negative space of enslaved voices are not represented as clearly. And also, isn't the kind of discourse that ancient people had different from what we think of as like modern public conversations?
Okay. A couple of things. One is, I don't think in the 19th century that it was only rhetorical. Slaveholders were in the South were being shamed as being unchristian by abolitionists. And there was a real fear that if there weren't this continual addition of slave states, if there weren't various jiggerings of the way people were counted, that slavery as an institution would be forced to come to an end. There wasn't a similar kind of challenge in the ancient world. And then we come to your second point, I think, which is that protests against slavery in the ancient world, and there were critics of slavery, we don't really know what they said too much. There certainly the voices of slaves tended to be silenced. And I would begin with an assumption that there were a lot of things about being slaves and a lot of things about their masters that they didn't like and complained about. Whether they were articulating an objection to slavery itself, we don't know this. That eventually did come, though, later with who was it? It was one of the Nazarene fathers, and his name is just escaping me, but it would have been in the fourth century, where on theological grounds there was a rejection of slavery itself, in that it was wrong for one human being to own another human being who was the image of God. But this was an intellectual, let's say. The social attitudes that accepted slavery were always there and in place. And on an institutional level, we don't really know that it was challenged.
I imagine industrialization probably went a long way to helping make the argument that we don't need to continue to just look for free labor if we have machines more and more broadly to do labor for us. Whereas in the ancient world,
Yeah.
there are no such inventions to replace this human effort. And so it is much easier to just arrive at the conclusion. If you want to get work done, you have to have people to do it, in the same way that you have beasts of burden to carry these things. So getting to the idea that it's natural, and that being something that shows up in the literature, that seems a little bit more natural, or an easier thing to accept. Is that fair to say?
I really agree with you there. And that is, I think that the Industrial Revolution, the transformation of agriculture, all of those kinds of things and the growth of cities in England, all of those things made it possible to, in a sense, to consider a world without slavery. And it was a bigger lift. Now, whether ancient slaves did not think of a world without slavery is less clear. We certainly know that ancient slaves thought of a world in which they themselves were not enslaved. They themselves and their loved ones and friends were not slaves. But how far they took that, I don't know. But just because we don't see it, I don't think necessarily that we should rule out that there might have been thinking along those lines. But it was harder then.
That makes me think about the literary creators who were formerly enslaved themselves. Okay, so they may not. I'll let you speak to who they are and what they might be saying. I'm assuming, based on what I know of the ancient world, they're probably not going to have a great amount of eagerness to run toward a radical opinion on what the world should look like. For a formerly enslaved creator of literature in the ancient world, what are we going to see on the whole? How are they depicting enslavement and enslaved people and enslavers?
They're various. A friend of mine, Amy Richland, has written a book on Plautine comedy, and the title, oh yeah, Slave Theater in the Roman Republic. And she argues that a lot of, one of the things about Plautus, again, I wrote my dissertation on him, was that he made the central character, the comic hero of his plays, a clever slave who outwitted his master and managed always to make things work and avoid a beating at the same time. And Amy, in her book, noted how there are a lot of protests that are inserted into those plays, a lot of grumbling about beatings and hard work and hunger and misuse and masters who are stupid. It's basically a depiction of the world turned around from the point of view of slaves. And a lot of this may have come in the performers of these comedies who were either enslaved or of very low social status. And in my own book, where I write about the ancient novel, these ancient Greek novels, the protagonists are elite citizens who they meet, they fall in love, they're married, or they're headed in that direction. Then they go on a sea journey and they're kidnapped by pirates or some other kind of calamity like that. And they are made into slaves. And they go through all of the terrible stuff that happens to slaves. And the people that enslaved them are really awful there. So you have that. You have a kind of protest of them. But at the end, the protagonists, the man and the woman, they're reunited and they are restored to their previous status, and they resume their previous lives. The the interesting account there is that while they are enslaved, the really wicked characters are their enslavers. The ordinary slaves, and that is, we could call them real slaves, people who are not noble born, often assist them or help them. There's like a kind of suggestion of solidarity there. And I think the argument is complex, and I don't think this is the place to go into the texts and look at the evidence that suggests why this particular author could have been a slave. But
It is if you want it to be.
well, he says he was the undersecretary. One of the authors, a man named Carrington, says that he was the undersecretary of a public speaker, and he describes himself in terms of his employment and his employer. This indicates someone of a potential enslaved background. and also the particular job description, and that would be an educated slave. So that's the argument there. And I think then what you have is a depiction of individuals who are very sympathetic, not just to the plight of protagonists who are unfortunately enslaved elite citizens, but protagonists who are slaves, period, who've become enslaved, period. In the literature, I think, if you look carefully through the cracks of what is often a kind of, what is at first view a kind of seamless presentation of elite attitudes and prejudices, you can actually see how other points of view have been, we might say, slipped in one way or another.
So I'm I have my questions over here to my left. And I'm
Yeah.
okay, so I'm thinking about the part in your chapter where you discuss Pliny the Younger telling the story of, I may be saying this wrong, Larcius Macedo.
That's good.
Oh, thank you. Just lob that out there.
Yeah.
Who was essentially murdered by enslaved people. And the story goes from Pliny describing him as a cruel master
Right.
to then saying he was the victim here. And it seems like that combined with the story that you were just talking about, these people captured, it almost seems like it's really a question of who needs to be othered here.
Mhm.
So there's a kind of a, I don't know, a paroxysm in there where Pliny's, this guy was not nice, but still, this is wrong and they shouldn't have done this. Or in the case of outside, which I'm assuming it was some kind of foreign piracy that led to these people's enslavement. And so that can be nothing but cruel. And the enslaved people alongside them can be viewed as sympathetic or lending sympathy to the protagonists. But it almost seems like there's a series of switches that can be flipped on and off in these kinds of retellings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The issue with, Larcius Macedo, he was at his villa and which had their own private baths, and he was attacked in the bath at a vulnerable moment and beaten senseless and all of that. And Pliny starts out by saying he was a cruel master. And then he adds that maybe he'd forgotten that his own father had been a slave. And then Pliny pauses and then very snidely he says, or maybe he remembered that all too well. And the point of that little aside is that there was something servile about Larcius Macedo and his cruelty that was the cruelty or brutality that we might associate with slaves who, deep down in Pliny's unconscious, were not fully human. And I say that deep down because Pliny was really a Stoic, and the Stoics believed that slaves were fully human. They believed that every human being had some share of the divine logos in their soul that made them rational. And this is why the Stoics counseled that Stoic slave owners should treat their slaves kindly because they were human beings, and that legal slavery didn't really matter because it was just a matter of bad luck, like what happened to the protagonists in the novels. Pliny, the Stoic in Pliny, the left side of his brain is saying rationally, this was caused by Macedo's cruel treatment of these other human beings. It was like when Seneca wrote maybe 100 years ago, saying, we don't make slaves are not born our enemy, we make them so by our contemptuous treatment of them. But then there's still, even at that moment in the beginning, when he's blaming the cruel slave master, for what happened. There's a part that can't resist saying it makes sense. His father was a slave, but he seems to have forgotten it, or maybe he remembers it. It comes through in the blood. And that little sneaking suspicion is fully realized as Pliny then, and this is how we go from point A to point B, where Pliny says this is what happened to him. And so, in other words, slave owners all around, Pliny hears he didn't read it in the newspaper. He heard it from friends. Did you hear what happened to the urban praetor Larcius Macedo? And then they describe what happens, how they attacked him in the bath and they pummeled him and they kicked him in his balls. And then they threw him down on the hot floor of the bath, because the floors of a Roman bath it was on the arc in terms of their design. There was a hot air running between them, so they were warm. And think of a hot beach parking lot on the black asphalt or something in the summer. They threw him down on the floor and he didn't move because he was unconscious, but he wasn't dead. And then they ran away, and eventually he was revived by what Pliny describes as a number of his more faithful slaves. I think that the journey from part A to point B, where Pliny concludes and he says, none of us are safe, even those of us like those who are kind masters, but we're surrounded by danger all the time and by nasty looks and insolent gestures and things like that. He scared himself. Going from point A to point B, he imagined the attack on this guy Larcius Macedo, and he realized it could have been me. And he gets back to that point where he says, they're not rational creatures. It's their own brutality, their lack of reasoning capacity that makes them murderers there. So he falls right back on the stereotype, on the social prejudice that said that said they're not fully rational. There's a part of them that's brutal.
I'm thinking back now to the comparison of 19th century attempt to apologize or polemicize for slavery, and a lot of it was predicated on this same fear, the understanding that they had of enslaved people in their presence were a constant threat. And to varying degrees, you had people like Nat Turner in the 19th century, or you had people like Spartacus in the ancient world, where there is a degree of success of enslaved people rising up. And so it's a constant fear. I think rhetorically, it seems, and please correct me if this is a wrong understanding, it seems like rhetorically in the ancient world, they're a little bit more okay with just looking at the story and seeing that it validates their priors. I don't think they feel like they have to do as much mental gymnastics. Does that kind of check out?
It sounds like you move from one point to another.
I do that.
And the first one I got, and the second one I'll need to hear again because it got a little fuzzy to me. But the first one is that I think it has to do with the nature of social prejudices, which is a kind of mild term for some things that can be really ugly and brutal. And I think we see, in terms of white stereotypes of African American slaves and Roman stereotypes of enslaved peoples who came from all over the Mediterranean, a lot of common themes. And a lot of this is in the chapter, and that is that slaves are both infantilized and depicted as cowards on the one hand, and then they're also depicted as brutes in their potential on the other. And coincidentally, in American slavery, African American men, male slaves would be called boy. There, it's still a stinging and resented put down. But Greek and Roman slaves were called boy as well. The Latin and Greek equivalents of that. It worked the same way. And we also have stereotypes of female slaves, which tend to focus less in the area of courage or its lack on the one hand, and focus more on sexual continence or its lack there as well. But same stereotypes there. And it comes down, I think, to what's going on in social stereotyping, which is basically participating and transmitting an ideology that is meant to justify treating a class of people in a particular way. And to the degree that we don't have slavery, but we have inequality. And it's remarkable how those kinds of prejudices can survived, in our case, the end of slavery, and went in with modifications into Reconstruction. But we see it here with plenty. Even after freedom, a freedman, an ex-slave, didn't immediately acquire the character of a freeborn person, someone who was also free by nature. And we see that even in Pliny's snide little aside there as well. But he was frightened.
I think broadly, whether we're talking about an enslaver in the 19th century, or an enslaver in the ancient world, or someone who attempts to leverage the fear of one class of people over and against another class of people, is the desire to accumulate power. And if you have to look, if you see an instance of, oh, this guy who owned people was beaten by those people and eventually died from the beating he received from those people, and you know that he was cruel, it validates your priors to say, yep, child of an enslaved person. It doesn't matter. This new money guy, he comes along
Yeah.
and he ends up being just as bad as you think, because of course he did. So you it's the constant desire to say, my power, my position is what is paramount. And to take a completely different example, if you look at the idea that, like, and this has been used against a lot of different people, enslaved people and otherwise, oh, they're not masculine, they're effeminate, which is a sign of weakness, and they are also a threat to idealized masculinity. And I'm speaking so generally because that could be Nazi propaganda against Jews, that could be enslavers' propaganda against slaves, that could be applied to, it could be post Reconstruction Jim Crow references,
Yeah.
that could be talking about gay people. Does that make sense? That it is about the accumulation of power at its core.
Yeah, and the interest, it is that, and the point you're making, and I agree with this, is that a lot of the themes having to do with masculinity, being a male citizen, the display, the Latin term was virtus, our word virtue, but in Latin, etymologically, it means the quality of being a man in that way. These stereotypes, in a sense, they're focused around very similar themes: manliness, courage, virtue, telling the truth, honesty, all of those kinds of things. They focus around there. And part of it, the really insidious thing is that part of a survival strategy for ancient slaves is that they have to be clever, they have to be tricky, they have to anticipate what can happen to them, because in terms of physical power, they have much less or none. So they have to lie sometimes in order to survive, when telling the truth, no, master, I did steal that pig, that would get them in a lot of trouble. So we know that I think that there are parallel literary traditions as well. In ancient fables, where you have tricksters who manage their way more successfully when they meet superior force, and then also in the folklore tradition of African Americans that came out of and was shaped by slavery.
Yeah, if you look around long enough, you're going to find that everybody has tricksters. Like even in the Bible, Jacob is a trickster, and he doesn't really get the bad rap that he deserves.
Ah,
But yeah, or you get
right.
characters like Anansi or Briar Rabbit, who are they're tricksters, and they're like depending on the way that you bring it up, you may be sympathetic or not.
Yeah.
But okay, I don't want to run out of time and forget this. So
Yeah.
if I understand correctly what you mean by reading against the grain, reading against the grain is not simply like reading an ancient depiction of enslavement on either side of it and just accept. So you're not just accepting what you're reading, and you're also not simply rejecting what the author is saying out of hand, but rather looking for the voice of people who are not speaking within a text. I mean, I guess I'm gonna leave it there to see if I'm understanding that correctly.
I think you are. Reading against the grain is reading and not automatically accepting the point of view, the ideological point of view of the author. And let's say, as is often the case, most often the case, that the author is a slave owner. An example that I note in the chapter concerns this writer by the name of Varro, who wrote a how to farming guide, an agricultural manual. And he is advising how to run. And when I say he was a farmer, he was really the farm owner. And his land would be farmed by, not by Varro himself, but by tenant farmers, and in many cases by slave labor. And he recommends various kinds of configurations of labor. And he said, if you live far away from this a particular estate, don't farm it out by slaves and use tenant farmers, because slaves, when you can't visit them and be look over their shoulders enough, they'll ruin the place. They'll mess up the accounts, they'll steal grain, they'll sell the equipment, they won't treat the animals right, they won't do their jobs correctly because they're either negligent or lazy or corrupt. These are all parts of the stereotype of slaves. And we can maybe accept to some degree what Varro says, and that is that slaves who are not adequately supervised will not work the way you want them to. Okay, we can take that. But reading against the grain, we don't have to accept his explanation for why that's the case. And his explanation is basically they're immoral. We can maybe pretty easily think of another explanation, and that is maybe they don't want to work harder than they need to. And maybe when they can, they'll create some space for themselves where they don't have to work as hard as they might, and where they get a little more than they would otherwise and manage to get away with it. So that would be, I guess, what I'm saying is when we read against the grain, we might read suspiciously in that way. So that would be one strategy for reading against the grain.
So I guess I wonder, can you go into a little bit more detail about what the tenant farmer's experience would have been with a landlord as opposed to an enslaved person with an enslaver?
As opposed to an enslaved person, they would work for a share, for rent, and they would have more of a stake in things turning out well than slaves would. And that's why, in a case of an agricultural estate that is at a distance, that the owner cannot visit it too frequently, he recommends that you should rent that land out because the tenant farmer has more of a stake in the outcome.
Okay, so that really does resonate, I think, even with contemporary experience.
Okay.
Although not it's not the same as wage labor. but and we had tenant farmers in this country, and that was a thing that
Yeah.
succeeded enslavement. But it almost seems like not that kind of exploitation, this kind of exploitation, because we're still not talking about citizens on equal footing.
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's not this idealized capitalist kind of understanding of two
Right.
people
Right.
enter into a contract. Okay. And it's mutually beneficial as much as it needs to be. It's you carry more liability when you deal with enslaved people because that's what they are to you, is they are liabilities and assets. And so you're better off going this way because it might cost you less. And that's what the whole enterprise is about, is what it costs you in labor and material. I just want to make sure I understood what the distinction between those two
Yeah.
things is. So reading that and seeing, okay, so he's offering this up as a solution. So he clearly has these assumptions about enslaved people, but also about the institution overall, and assumptions about what it is to deal with a tenant as opposed to in the other direction. Okay, just making sure I
Yeah.
understand.
He's not really questioning the institution at all. He is noting an instance where the institution bears a high cost, and that is that in order to extract the profit that you might from a slave, you need to apply force, you need to apply coercion. So if you get into a situation where agricultural slaves, in this instance, are left without suspicion, then the value of you won't get the return that you want on the farm, and the value of the farm itself will be hurt as well. As a system, as an extractive system, you had to put a certain amount of investment, in this case, in terms of coercion, to make slave labor work.
When I read that in your chapter about this description, it reminded me of, and I don't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but reading a book called White Trash. And she talks about James Oglethorpe, who was responsible for the establishment of the colony of
Yeah,
Georgia.
yeah,
And he demanded that slavery not be permitted. Eventually, obviously, it was, but that slavery not be permitted. And at first glance, you're like, oh, that's cool. And then you find out he's because it makes white people morally weak. It's, oh, you were so close. And it's on the one hand, it's a question of moral utility. On the other hand, in the ancient world, it's a question of, is this institution, which is a tool for you to accomplish accumulation or maintenance of wealth, is it the right tool in this case? No, I don't think so. So it's, if you described in general, yeah, he said don't use slaves for offsite farms. Wow, that's okay. That's pretty good. He said it because he thinks they're shifty and untrustworthy.
yeah.
They don't care. So it's just, yeah, oh man, what a bummer. What a rug pull.
Right. Yeah. We might say in such a situation, maybe a system that will only work if it demands constant supervision and input and force and all of that. There's something wrong with the system. He couldn't go there.
Yeah, that could be. I look, I know in all of the interactions I've had around this book and thinking about enslavement, it's just made me really appreciate the movie Django Unchained so much more, and how gratifying it is to see that kind of cartoonish violence turned on people who thought it was okay to own other people. You don't have to share that opinion. That is purely Jared.
It, I have my feelings. I have an opinion about that movie. I need to fetch it back. It has something. There was a way in which it was like an analogy to pornography in a way, where like pornography is to Eros as the violence of that movie maybe was to justice.
Yeah, Inglorious Bastards too. That's another one. Obviously, same
I see a pattern here. Yeah.
same yeah, same kind of thing, that
Yeah.
where it's just, yeah, settle in for a good, what, 90 minutes, 2 hours of just watching terrible people be murdered.
Yeah.
It just, yeah, certain amount of gratification out of that. Okay, so because we're coming up close on an hour,
Yeah.
I want to know, is there anything from your chapter that you were hoping I would ask about that I have failed to thus far?
Ah, the you a lot of what you were saying, I was thinking over your questions, and a number of your questions had to do I think, with the idea of the depiction of, since we were dealing with stereotypes of people, you're thinking of stereotypes of slave owners as well. And if there were any depictions of an ideal owner in that way, and condemnations of particular owners. And I guess what one has to do with, you asked about the owner who's depicted as wicked or bad in one of your questions. And once again, when we're dealing with opinions and ideas that are formulated by slave owners, they always end up being, in a sense, self serving. You might see initially a kind of what looks like sympathy that might be expressed for slaves, but if you look a little deeper, it ends up being self serving. For example, there were a number of slave wars in antiquity where you had where you had resistance that was practiced in a variety of different ways very frequently. Sometimes it would erupt into a something that would grow into a rebellion. And one of these rebellions happened on the island of Sicily in the 130s BCE, and it happened on a particular estate. And an ancient historian writing about, what would it be, over 100 years after those events, a man by the name of Diodorus Siculus, writing about the outbreak of this rebellion, described how it broke out on the estate of a man named Demophilus, who was a particularly cruel and arrogant slave owner. And you will see, especially among writers like this Diodorus of Sicily, Diodorus Siculus, who was influenced by Stoics, you will see a kind of condemnation of examples of what they would pull out as severe cruelty among slave owners. And I think quite often they're not by any means questioning slavery itself. They find bad slave owners, let's say. We might say all slave owners are bad, okay? They would pick out bad slave owners who, for them, in a way, they were useful because it gave them the opportunity to say that in this case, the apple is rotten, and not really realize that the problem is with the barrel. And we would see depictions of slave owners as wicked, but it would not be on the part of people of that class. It would not be as a way of depicting problems with the system itself, let's say. It would be a way of saying that there was a problem with this particular individual, and a way of actually maybe of avoiding an escape, of coming to terms and thinking about why people like that would be wicked. And it had to do, and maybe facing up to the idea that it had to do with the unlimited power that they had over these other individuals, which I think was ultimately corrupting and warping and destructive of their humanity. So that was one thing.
I'll just say I'm glad we don't do that kind of thing anymore
Oh, no,
in the
absolutely
world.
not.
We've progressed past that. What would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch, etc., to get a better understanding of ancient literature or the depictions of enslavement in the ancient world, or just any of the other things that you study or are interested in?
I would say, I would say, buy this book
Yeah.
and buy one for every member of your family. And if you have pets that know how to read, you might get them a copy.
Are you getting that many points on the back end from this book?
Completely unsolicited. Your dog or cat might know how to read, and they're just hiding it from you, especially in the case of the cats. And actually, speaking seriously, the volume that Christy and Catherine edited is it's very good to make you think about, in terms of creating a mindset about how you might approach another ancient text, and that is the books of the New Testament, any early Christian writing, anything written at that time, because slavery was universal. It was the water that people swam in, and it was so much there that, in a sense, it was invisible to the people who were living in it in certain respects, even though slaves would be around them all the time. And we have to do a little more work when we read extra ancient texts in order to make slaves visible in that way, to be aware of them. And the ancient slavery in its New Testament contexts, coming from a variety of points of view, really does so much to help people come to it with that frame of mind. And that has to do with both with Christian literature, but also with ancient pagan literature. Think of the possibility that individuals involved in this scene might be slaves. Think of them as being there. And sometimes nothing will change in terms of how you appreciate the reading. Other times something might shift in a way and you'll see a little more. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
Okay. In one of the other ancient novels that I read and write about, and this one was written around 170 AD, the title is from the names of the protagonists, the young woman Leucippe and her lover Cleitophon. Okay. And they meet. Leucippe and her entourage come to where Cleitophon and his family live. They're both like 20 or something, and they're at the house of Cleitophon's father. And Cleitophon sees Leucippe, and it's like love at first sight. And so Cleitophon is the narrator here, and he describes a welcoming dinner that was held that first night there. And he talks, there are 6 people there, Leucippe and Cleitophon, his parents, and then Leucippe's mother as well. He just describes the dinner guests. He doesn't describe everybody else that was there, and that would have been everybody else in the room who was serving at the table at that meal, and as well as all of the cooks and everyone else. And all of these people were slaves. They were in the room too. When he does describe an enslaved person, it's part of the entertainment. It's a singer, an enslaved boy, a pice. Cleitophon calls him a boy, who came out and sings a musical composition to the lyre that's about Apollo seeing Daphne and falling in love with her. So he mentions this one slave, but it's only because it's on an erotic theme that at that moment had meaning for Cleitophon, because he was looking with very hungry eyes over at Leucippe at that moment. Everyone else who's in the room doesn't get a mention. So it's like you mentioned, going back to when we were talking in the beginning, how the Industrial Revolution and all those machines made it easier to think of a world without slaves. In a sense, people did think of their slaves, enslaved people, as machines, as objects who did work, and they wouldn't merit comment, as we don't think of the refrigerator or the toaster noticing it much in that way. So it's about how these authors won't mention or note slaves or think about the conditions of their enslavement or think very much or very hard about the humanity of their slaves, because in the end, they would be there to serve them, much as we think of the implements of everyday life serving us.
I'm not sure if you have Netflix or not, but if you do, I would recommend the murder mystery called The Residence. And I think of that because
Oh, saw that.
You watched it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So there's a right. I won't try to give a lot away, but there is a monologue
yes,
that refers to something that's been communicated by several of the staff at the White House
yeah,
as being in the room but not in the room, and in the room and privy to information that they are just unaware people are communicating
yeah,
because of the culture of this workplace. And it's never explicitly said, but it really does seem, it seems like it's a reasonable inference to say the White House in its early days was likely staffed by enslaved people, and that this mentality of porters and people who work in the White House has carried over from that understanding of servitude, because that, and it is brought up as something that's very different. It is an aberration when you think about labor in our society, but it is this culture. And what you were saying there made me think of that. But I also really liked The Residence. It's an excellent murder mystery.
I thought so too. And I love the way it was like an American upstairs, downstairs, or Gosford Park. And the servants in those Brit upper class fantasy things are notionally free people. But the question of power and differentiation of power still plays a role, and it forms attitudes, and it forms the way people are seen or not seen, just as it is in slavery. I remember I in one of the courses here at Ohio University that I taught on slavery, I remember a student, a girl who was white, worked as a waitress for Ohio University dining services. And she waited on a meeting of the trustees. And of course, the trustees are these high rollers, these millionaires that become trustees because they know the governor of the state of Ohio and they have a lot of money and might give some of it. And they also have a certain attitude about their place in society. And this student of mine, a young woman, she said, and I was talking about that notion of not being seen. She said she waited at this dinner and she found it was like a slap in the face because she was just not noticed. Her personhood, she didn't expect to sit down at the table and have a glass of wine with one of the guests, like what happened in the residence there at one point. But she didn't expect that to happen. But there was a way in which her presence as another human being was invisible to these people. It struck her, and it was a real slap in the face. It was one of the smartest personal comments ever made in a class that I taught here. And so I think that these we come back to the question of power and what power does to people and how they react to it and respond to it when there are differences. And even a little bit of difference can make itself felt in those ways.
You're making me think of tip culture too, which is an interesting little, I don't know, a two-step kind of thing of you want to stand out, and doing a good job means getting recognized and receiving financial reward for that excellence. And also there's a thing about being in the service industry of blending in. And I think that's a very American thing because other people
Yeah.
don't understand our tip culture thing. Yeah, but we don't need to unpack that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you read for fun?
I will read mysteries there. And you didn't tell me, Jared, that there was going to be a trick question.
Yeah.
I know. What do I read for fun? I'll tell you, I very much lately the historical novels of Robert Harris. And he wrote Conclave, and which got an Oscar, the movie version of it, on the election of a new pope. But he has also written a whole series of historical novels set in ancient Rome. And he really, speaking from the point of view of a classicist, Harris really does his homework. And I find that his reconstruction of ancient mentalities, like the mentality of an ex slave in his novel Pompeii, it's absolutely believable. Not like it was that way, because we don't know that, but it could really have been that way. And that's pretty amazing.
I'm not him, obviously, but it seems like if I wrote a novel set in a time period and a subject matter expert on that time period said this is believable, because you could be like Neil deGrasse Tyson when he sees a Star Wars movie and he's there's no way that robot could roll around on the sand.
Right.
You could be picking it apart, but you're not. You're saying this seems plausible. Yeah, that'll be in the show notes. Anything else you would throw out there?
That's all I've got for now.
Okay. Yeah, and I like that question to be a surprise because it often is a mirror up for you guys to because many academics who've come on here, they'll say, I like the reading I do for work. And then I get to validate that and be like, then that's what you like. Because I think often academics think that it's not okay and that they shouldn't enjoy their work. But yeah, if you read extracurricular stuff, that's great. If you don't, that's also great.
Yeah. And you came at me with the question where I'm doing a lot of intense reading for work right now on various projects. So a lot of the non-pro reading has been put aside. That's why it came across as a difficult question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a brick to the face.
Yeah.
William Owens, thank you so much for being here.
Jared, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. Okay, and that is episode 100 done. Thank you to everyone who's been there with me since episode 1 back in March of 2023. I really appreciate this. I appreciate the support. As of today, sitting here, recording this, looking at my YouTube followers, I am over 100, which is a big deal. I wasn't doing much on YouTube and I wasn't seeing any growth. And it turns out those two things kind of correlate. So over the last few months, I forget when, honestly, I started dropping preview stuff. So everything I said at the top of the episode also, applies here. Shoot me your feedback. Let me know what you want. Like, subscribe, rate, review, reach out. You may know someone, you may be an adherent to a tradition that I have not covered yet. I've only had a few episodes in that series. So shoot me a name, suggestion. If your denomination or religious group is one that engages with biblical texts in any way, I want to talk to someone from that tradition, preferably clergy, just to safeguard myself and my guests from being lambasted. I want someone who is actually credentialed by the tradition and not just speaking on their own behalf. That said, next week, Greg Carey and I will be discussing his book, Rereading Revelation. This is I don't worry about getting episodes out super quickly, unless the guests ask. I don't worry about that. I feel like biblical studies, biblical texts are a pretty evergreen topic, but this is a pretty recent book. This book came out in 2025, and I think Revelation is a book that people talk about and think about a lot, and they can always do with maybe a little bit of remedial education, and Greg Carey's book is a helpful version of that. So you can hear this now for $5 a month on Patreon. But here's a quick preview now. If you get a chance to love someone, please take it.
So, I can sympathize strongly with those readers of Revelation who say, this is a call for nonviolent resistance against oppression. That's how I want to read it too. And you read my book, you see me bending in that way. But But I can't explain all the problems in Revelation away, the misogynistic language, the celebration of the violence and judgment that occurs. All of that it's what it is. The other thing I would say is, even within Revelation, you see that not all the Jesus followers are diagnosing their situation the same way John is. In chapters 2 and 3, he names these apparently competing prophets who are within the churches. They're not outside the churches. And they apparently have audiences. He calls them Balaam, the Nicolaitans, Jezebel. These are all fictitious and, at least in 2 of the 3 cases, slanderous names. But what he's acknowledging is they interpret the moment differently. And why does he give them so much energy if there aren't other Jesus followers who disagree with John and see it the way these other prophets do?